Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. As Pat mentioned, my name's Amanda Lefton. I am the Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And on behalf of BOEM and the Department of the Interior, I'd like to welcome you to what is the fifth and final fisheries community meeting on the New York Bight leasing process. Many of you have taken the time out of your busy schedules to meet with BOEM staff recently to discuss a number of topics, including the request for information regarding fisheries mitigation and the draft planning areas in the Central Atlantic. And more broadly, you've continued to participate on project-specific environmental assessments. I really appreciate and want to thank you for your time and input into all of these processes. I know that, of course, your time is very valuable. As you know, last week, the Secretary of the Interior, the governors of New Jersey and New York, and the president of the AFL-CIO announced that BOEM will hold an offshore wind lease auction for the New York Bight next month. We're here today to follow up with you and provide more detail on what was included in the final sale notice, including the lease areas and new requirements for developers. And I want to note that we are committed to continuing the conversation as the process advances. Throughout the course of the last several years, from the call area in 2018 to the final sale notice just announced last week, we've had active engagement with a variety of stakeholders and ocean users, including the commercial fishing industry, throughout our process. And based in part on your overwhelming feedback, we've reduced the initial area by a total of 72%. As you may recall, the proposed sale notice, of which we came together to discuss last, offered 8 lease areas with 627,000 acres. Based off the feedback from you and other ocean users, the sale will offer 6 lease areas covering 488,000 acres offshore New York and New Jersey. And that's a 22% reduction from the proposed sale notice to the final sale notice. I'm going to take a moment and share my screen and actually show you these lease areas. We're going to go over these in more detail today, but this is truly a big piece of what we're here to discuss. As I noted, we went from 8 lease areas to 6 lease areas. We reduced the overall area just from the proposed sale notice to the final sale notice by 22%. So that's a 72% reduction overall. And you can see these colored marks here. Those are the actual lease areas themselves. Those will what will be offered. And you can see that generally, and we'll go over this in a little more detail from the proposed sale notice to here, as well as from the call areas to how we ended up here today. You can see that a significant reduction happened over here in the western part of this lease area. And you see that we included buffer areas between lease areas as previously requested. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment because we're going to go over this in much more detail today, but that's just an initial look to give you a high-level overview of what these lease areas are. And generally, these lease areas in the final sale notice represent a balance of future and existing uses with the need for orderly and expeditious offshore wind energy development. Many of you participated in one of 4 virtual meetings on the New York Bight last summer. Based on your feedback from the proposed sale notice, we've built a strong foundation for enhancing engagement. This foundation is designed to embed transparency, accountability, and communication into the process. You also asked us to follow up on that, follow up with information on the final sale notice. And today we're here as a direct result of that request to follow up, explain our process, where we've arrived, and also to continue to discuss how we can ensure that there is a seat at the table for ocean users like the commercial fishing industry moving forward. Today, we'll explain how we arrived at the final lease areas and this new engagement process. You know, one of the challenges we've heard is that stakeholders, government partners, and ocean users need to be at the table from the very beginning of the process, before projects are developed and submitted to BOEM. This morning, we'll talk about new approaches to require that early consultation and solicit your input as we implement the new processes put in place by the final sale notice. Now, I realize that you've all heard some version of this before. I know you've been frustrated by a perceived lack of communication and transparency from us, that you take time to provide feedback and you don't know where the information goes or what changes result from it. That's in part why we're here today, to help explain that process and how we've arrived here. I want to note that we hear you. And most importantly, we're doing things differently because of your comments. We're implementing new reporting requirements designed to improve communication between future lessees, tribes, ocean users, disadvantaged communities, partners, and other stakeholders. We're learning how you want to engage with developers, what content should be in new required reports, and how you can provide feedback on the information provided. We're requiring lessees to identify tribes, underserved communities, commercial fishing industries, and other ocean users who will be affected by offshore wind development. And we will hold companies accountable for improving their engagement, communication, and transparency with these communities. We're also updating existing lease stipulations to kickstart domestic supply chain development and encourage the use of project labor agreements. We're approaching things differently beyond the New York Bight too. Thanks to your feedback, we're advancing a mitigation framework. We're also changing our approach to wind energy area identification. The Central Atlantic is an example. Before advancing a call for information, there were a series of meetings held and discussions to ensure that ocean users, stakeholders, and partners are at the table from the very beginning of the process to find areas of least conflict. Because in the end, we want ocean uses like offshore wind and commercial fishing to not only exist, but to thrive. BOEM's mandate is to take into account many competing interests. And I acknowledge that means that no single party will get everything that they want, but we'll work to ensure that everyone sees themselves in the process. Before I turn things over to the BOEM team, I want you to know that I sincerely believe that we can continue to build a strong foundation for engagement between BOEM, lessees, and ocean users within the New York Bight. We know that to make that happen, we need to have open and honest discussions with you to find solutions for our communities while helping to realize the potential in the region. Here in the New York Bight, we're working from this foundation and will develop projects that produce clean, renewable energy and realize the potential and ensure that projects reflect your knowledge and historic use of the sea. Projects that create good paying jobs and encourage the successful coexistence of multiple ocean users. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and continuing this conversation well beyond today. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I'll now turn it over to the team who's going to walk us through the different considerations and feedback that we heard through the process, from the call area in 2018 to the lease areas included in the final sale notice last week. Thanks again for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Pat.
Great, Amanda, thank you so much. So what we're going to do is, again, as Amanda said, the BOEM team wants to kind of explain kind of how they moved through the process to get to the final sale notice, including the kind of the spatial arrangement of lease areas, as well as the requirements in the final sale notice. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but they want to kind of cover the range of things so you can kind of see the whole as it is. And then after that, we're going to take questions folks have about all of this afterwards, again, focused first and foremost on fishermen, kind of as first discussants. So the presentation, probably going to take roughly about a half hour. So bear with us, but it's going to go through and try to explain the rationale and reasoning, and then we'll open up for questions. We want to keep it conversational and friendly. And as noted for those folks joining late, we are recording this, so folks who aren't here can listen in to understand the decision after today as well. So with that, Luke, I'm going to turn it over to you and the BOEM team, and you can share your slides and off we'll go.
All right. Can folks see my screen here?
You see those? It's not in presentation mode. There we go. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Wonderful. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Luke Feinberg, and I am a project coordinator here at BOEM and working on the New York Bight for quite some time, and happy to explain the story today of how we got to where we are. So today we'll be, again, reviewing about how we arrived at the lease areas within the final sale notice, provide an overview of what we heard in response to the proposed sale notice, and discuss BOEM's final decisions. But before we do that, we just want to take some time to acknowledge both your time and resources that you put into not only this process, but just the whole BOEM process as a whole, and how important that is to making sure that we do our jobs well. And specifically, recently, there's been some valuable feedback on multiple fronts. First, the request for information regarding fisheries mitigation, several meetings for that effort. As Amanda mentioned, the draft planning areas for the Central Atlantic, and then more generally, public comment on all the projects we have going on through the environmental assessment phases through the National Environmental Policy Act. And I just want to point out that, again, the purpose of today's meeting is to review BOEM's final decisions in the New York Bight, but also to initiate a new chapter of engagement through this refined process that we'll introduce to obtain your feedback and hopefully develop these projects based on that new process. So first, let's talk about where we've been. As you all know, this is the New York Bight area. We have New Jersey coast here, followed by Long Island, and these are the existing lease areas before this effort started offshore New Jersey, offshore New York and New Jersey here with the Empire Wind site, and southern New England. The state of New York came to us and asked for additional leasing areas to consider. The areas in those green areas, green lines, were the areas they first thought that we should look at. We took a look at that and in 2018 developed a call area. That's the blue area there, which included over 1.7 million acres. Based on the information we received in that call for information and nominations, we developed what we call draft wind energy areas. And these draft wind energy areas is reduction of the call, and it was based on the information we received in response to it. So for example, the call included nominations from developers. So where would they like to see things developed? We took a lot of time and studied the fisheries activities in the New York Bight. This is a relative use index, which takes into account not only where fishing vessels have been based on AIS data, but also the value of those fisheries. And also general maritime traffic. So where are the vessels? Where are they not? You can see here, it's pretty clear that they do maintain travel through the Coast Guard designated zones. These are traffic separation schemes and fairways, but there's also a lot of travel outside of that. And it's also our duty not only to consider what is happening in the New York Bight, what has happened in the New York Bight, but what also may happen in the future. And so this, as part of this process, is a proposed U.S. Coast Guard fairway that would go across the New York Bight, as well as areas the Department of Defense considered critical for their training and military readiness activities. So all that information was digested, and over time we ended up with a decision for final wind energy areas. And so you can see that here, each of these wind energy areas has a name. There was a decrease or changes between the draft wind energy areas that we got feedback on the task force and the actual final wind energy areas. And you can see here, they were released in March of 2021, and they represent a 53% reduction of the call area itself, right? So we went from 1.7 million acres to 800,000 acres. And that area that's highlighted in green was the basis for our environmental assessment. Once we have the wind energy areas, we move forward with a proposed sale notice. I think most of you are very familiar with this, but these areas were published in June, and we did not include two wind energy areas, the fairways south and north, and highlighted the rest of them while carving up some of Hudson South. And that included a further reduction down to 64% of the original call areas were removed. So hopefully most of that is review for this audience. So we're going to dive into what we heard in response to the proposed sale notice. So at a very high level, this is not only the proposed sale notice itself, but as you remember, all your comments that were provided as part of the meetings that we had during the summer were incorporated into the docket. And so at a very high level, there's a very large number of topics. The size, orientation, number, location of the proposed areas. Definitely heard some fisheries concerns there. Identification of benthic habitat was key. requests for buffers and deferrals of key areas, several comments regarding the auction process itself, concerns from Native American tribes and user groups, as well as stakeholder engagement in general, much coming from the fishing industry requesting a more meaningful engagement process that promotes accountability, transparency, and communication. We also received comment on several questions we asked about lease stipulations regarding supply chain and project labor agreements. But what did we hear specifically from the fisheries? And we heard a lot, and this slide by no means is meant to be an exhaustive overview, but it's highlighting the key points that we heard. And it's really, in general, that the fisheries overlap with the proposed lease areas in the PSN. And there are pointed out areas of conflict and suggested further study to minimize impacts or perhaps defer lease sale of a certain area. So in broad strokes, we heard from the scallop industry about a deferment of central Bight to avoid scallop fishing activity that occurs in that area. Accompanying that request was a request for a 5 nautical mile buffer from the scallop rotational area in Hudson South. We saw that surf clam activity would be impacted by offshore wind energy construction in Hudson South specifically, as well as the central Bight area. And while there is perhaps less overlap with the pelagic and trawl fish industries, conflict still does exist. And recreational fishermen as well were primarily concerned with maintaining access to the lease areas and to transit within and through future facilities. Our federal partners at NOAA and NMFS recommended block withdrawal for areas with important habitats. So I'm going to highlight here the New Jersey sport fishing areas, and those are the areas that are outlined in yellow. And those are areas that sport fishing does occur, but the importance there was not necessarily the fact that you could not recreate, or recreational fishermen could not access those areas if an offshore wind farm was there. It's more that the fish are there because there's likely a unique habitat associated with it. And so that was an area that was recommended to be considered to be removed or avoided. Another item that was brought up was the mid-shelf scarp. And that's an area that we're highlighting here in blue, but you can also see that the layer here where there's some, goes to yellow here is meant to show the slope of the sea bottom. And you can see here where there's an overlay of the cyan color, there was a more pronounced slope, and that was an area that was suggested to be avoided as well. And lastly, NOAA pointed out several sanctuary proposals that are on the table in front of them in this region as well to consider. So BOEM certainly had a challenge in this process. The interests, as you know, are diverse, and certainly no acre in the New York Bight is conflict-free. Fishermen and commercial fisheries as a whole, scallop, surf clam, pelagics, and recreational, our resource agencies, most notably NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, United States Coast Guard, and the Department of Defense, all have equities in this region that we needed to deconflict. The states in the region, not just New York and New Jersey, but others, all have interest, whether they have constituents that fish in this region or plan to procure energy from future installations. And on the other side, dealing with developers who have the drive to build and the eagerness to get a lease area acquired, as well as being at this inflection point or moment in the domestic supply chain for a real chance for investment and creating real jobs related to offshore wind. And certainly tribal nations want to know how they can engage not only effectively and meaningfully, but also understand what the impacts may be, both positive and negative, and how they can benefit from the jobs created from these projects as well. So some key decisions were made to address this, and it is a balancing act indeed. And so overall, there was a 22% reduction from the areas that we proposed in the proposed sale notice to the final sale notice. We added several lease stipulations, which we will discuss, and also made some changes to the auction process, including allowing only one per bidder, or so only one lease area can be one per bidder, hoping to increase competition for state energy procurement and decreasing auction bonus bid prices. So as a whole, based on all this information that we received, and again, I want to thank everybody for the time they put into developing those comments. There clearly was a lot of thought put in that, and we tried to make sure that we did those comments justice. We took a fresh look at all the information we had, and as well as the new information that was received in response to the call. And so an example of that, through our conversations with the Department of Defense, they continued to refine their process, and they went from an area that was a little bit more encompassing here of an area to avoid to a smaller area that they considered essential to their training activities. But now I'm going to pass it on to our colleague Brian Hooker to explain from the fisheries perspective some of the more detailed analysis we underwent.
Thanks, Luke. So as Luke mentioned, I mean, there's a balancing act to our analysis, right? There's no single factor that led to a particular removal. We looked at multiple factors. We received it in public comment, as well as the need to meet some of the energy demands that states are asking BOEM on the leasing side. So on this slide, again, as Luke went over, what we're showing here is some of the areas that the National Marine Fisheries Service asked to withdraw, areas that are kind of labeled here as triple Rex and Dusky Hole and Fingers. Those are shoal features, and this area of about 1% to 2% slope that NIMS identified as the Mid-Atlantic Scarp. That's right along the edge. I think you can see, no, you can't see my cursor, but it's right around the edge there. Yeah, thanks, Luke. So next slide. So we looked at that, that was one set of information, set of evidence. And then we also did look at fishing activity. And I know we had a request specifically to look at, oceanographic, potential oceanographic impacts to the Mid-Atlantic Scallop access area. So we took a hard look at what evidence we had. We had just recently done a recent modeling report focused in Southern New England, and looked at the results of that and how it might support or not support a 5 nautical mile setback of leasing activity from the Mid-Atlantic Scallop access area. And we did not find any evidence to support that the potential negative impact of redistribution of scallops, scallop larvae outside of that access area would change or would benefit as a result of a 5 nautical mile setback. So we began to look at fishing activity, and especially what this image is showing is fishing activity, scallop fishing activity in a year when that Mid-Atlantic Scallop access area was closed. We did have previous comments from the National Marine Fisheries Service. I believe it was during the area identification stage that recommended some type of setback from the scallop access area for instances when the scallop access area was closed, and edge fishing and being able to transit around that access area in periods when it's closed. So we took a look at that VMS data, and then VMS data that's aggregated over periods when it is open, and looked at where those that activity was overlapping with recommendations for withdrawal that were received from other entities. So next slide, please. So here again is just another example of scallop VMS area aggregated from 2015 to 2016, again showing how the effort changes when it's closed and when it's open. And again, I think the main point here is that the importance of understanding that multiple factor approach, because there is heavy fishing activity throughout all the different areas. If it was based upon fishing activity alone, we'd have to reach different conclusions around all the lease areas. Next slide, please. Here's surf clam ocean quahog again. as we saw, we looked at areas of overlap with surf clam fishing. I think there was actually more fishing in the 2012 to 2014 timeframe in that kind of shoal area that was labeled on the previous slide as the fingers. Again, so looking at, yes, that's an area that's definitely utilized by the surf clam industry, and also requested for withdrawal by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Next slide, please. Again, as Luke mentioned, we do recognize that there are other fisheries that have operational concerns, even if their direct revenue is not as high from some of the areas that were under consideration. You mentioned this already. So next slide, please. So again, I think the main point here is to show that area of overlap in our consideration. Next slide. Cover that one. And then here's what the result was in the end. It resulted in a 2.5 mile setback from the Mid-Atlantic scallop access area removal. Actually, go back up one more and you can see kind of flipping back and forth between that northern area. Thanks, that's good. That northern area that overlapped both with fishing and the northern area of Hudson South, sorry. And also, good point, the Central Bight had a similar criteria where it overlapped with fishing and seafloor features that NIMS had concerns about. Okay, I think that brings us near to the conclusion of my section. And here's the.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So here's another depiction of the lease areas that we are going forward as final, and an outline of what was proposed in the proposed sale notice. So as again, you can see this lease was removed, not only due to a number of factors, fishing being one of them, also the Department of Defense, as well as United States Coast Guard issues, the buffer from the scallop rotational area here, not only due to fishing activities, but also allowed for transit through this area, and then the southern portion of Central Bight. And so these are the final lease areas, as you will see in the lease sale. And now I'm going to transition over to, I'm sorry, there we go. Yeah, so this portion of the sale, we end up with an area, right? So as Amanda mentioned, there's 488,000 acres, which is a 72% reduction from the call. And I think that's an important point to note, because really the foundation of our process is to gather information as we proceed through area ID and the leasing process, and to deconflict as we go. And so we did start with a rather large area, received information, and then reduce that accordingly, balancing all the factors that we discussed. But that's not all of it, right? The location is certainly an important part, but then how are actions implemented on those leases? And that's when the lease stipulations come in. And so what my colleague Zach Jolka is going to talk about is the new lease stipulations that we are providing in this package. And the first one is enhanced engagement, and also domestic supply chain and project labor agreements. So Zach, I will pass it to you to get started talking about the enhanced engagement.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. So yeah, my name is Zach Jolka. I'm another project coordinator with BOEM. And the graphic that you're seeing on your screen is depicting the new enhanced engagement lease stipulation, which you've heard a little bit about. This stipulation takes the form of a semi-annual progress report. The engagement process is designed to be cyclical and continuous. It emphasizes early and regular meaningful engagement. And it begins at lease issuance and extends through the approval of the construction operations plan, or the COP. As you can see, there are 4 main phases: engage, report, feedback, and refine. And integral to the process are the themes of accountability and transparency, and that's why they're central to the graphic. Now, BOEM created this new lease stipulation and reporting requirement in response to the comments that we received both through the PSN process and comment period, as well as, Luke had mentioned the meetings that we had last summer and how your feedback was incorporated, into that comment period. And, what we really heard was that from the fishing community, that previous engagement with developers has often felt like a check the box exercise. We heard that you weren't consulted early enough, and also that it was unclear how, if at all, the information that you provided was used to inform or change the project. So we really took that into mind when we designed this process in new lease stipulation to improve meaningful engagement. I also want to clarify that this process that I'm going to be speaking about is talking specifically about lessee or developer engagement with tribes, ocean users, including fisheries, underserved communities and stakeholders. And while BOEM is involved as the lessor and permitting agency, this process does not speak specifically to BOEM's engagement practices. All right, next slide. So the first phase that I'm going to talk about is engage, a natural place to start. And again, the engagement, while it's depicted here as a phase, it's continuous, and it's going to be happening throughout the reporting cycle. And the lease stipulation requires lessees to identify who, in this case, the tribes, ocean users, underserved communities, and other stakeholders that are potentially affected by the project. And then lessees or developers must track what engagement activities have taken place, when and where upcoming engagement activities will occur over the following 6 months. And we also just want to recognize that engagement is going to look different depending on your feedback and which party is being engaged. We're talking about a large group here, including tribes and fisheries and communities. So engagement is going to look different, and it's going to evolve throughout the lifespan of the project. Specific to tribes, fisheries, and agencies, there's a requirement to create communication plans, which essentially serve to add further structure and predictability to how that engagement is going to occur with those impacted groups. The plan requires very similar, there are similar requirements for each of those communication plans, minor differences that are tailored to the parties being consulted, but common to all the plans is a requirement to develop a draft of the communications plan within 120 days of lease execution, as well as to provide a designated lessee point of contact to the fisheries, tribes, and agencies, so that there's, again, a predictable person that you can engage with, direct your comments to, and expect to hear feedback from. And then lastly, there's a new requirement as part of the stipulation for coordinated engagement. And this is important, and it is, again, it's sort of in recognition of what we've been hearing from our engagement efforts and from the PSN process, and recognizing this burden on affected parties, including fisheries, that you're already having to consult on so many different projects in they're in different phases, different strains on your time. And we're about to add 6 new lessees through this final sale that's coming up in next month. So in recognition of that, this requirement requires lessees to engage and coordinate with one another, the other lessees, when practicable. And you can imagine a scenario, for instance, in Hudson South, where you have neighboring leases and developers might have a common impacted resource and a common need to engage with a certain fishery or a certain community about impacts to that resource. And under this requirement, they would need to coordinate with one another and provide perhaps a single meeting rather than 2 or 3 separate meetings on the same topic. And similarly, it can work in the reverse order, where an impacted group can then request a coordinated engagement meeting of the developers. You have a common concern across several different lease areas, and rather than having 3 meetings, you are going to request that they have a single meeting. So that's what the coordinated engagement requirement speaks to. All right, next slide. So next comes the report itself. So the lessees must generate a report to describe their engagement as depicted on the last slide. And the emphasis here is on transparency. So who does your project affect? Who have you met with, and how will that information you've received be used? And so specifically, again, the report's going to focus on engagement, the coordinated engagement activities, anticipated adverse effects, project changes to address adverse effects, describing transmission planning engagement, and any scheduled or anticipated engagement activities. And I really want to emphasize here that this report is not just a list of meetings that have occurred, and that there's a requirement that the lessee must document how, if at all, the design or implementation of the project has been informed by or altered to address the potential effects of the project. And that can include investments in or directing benefits to tribes, ocean users, underserved communities, et cetera. And the report frequency is every 6 months, unless otherwise directed by BOEM. All right, Luke, next slide. So next comes feedback. So it's really review and feedback. So BOEM will receive the reports after 6 months and review them for completeness and ensure that comments from the previous reporting period were addressed. And then BOEM's going to, in short order, post the reports on the website. There's going to be essentially a 60-day review process after that, where the public will have approximately 30 days to review the reports online and submit comments for correction or clarification in that current report, which then BOEM will kind of aggregate with our comments and pass along to the lessee. And then comments submitted after that time frame will still be accepted, but will likely be addressed in the subsequent report. Because remember, we're going to be getting another report every 6 months. And for public comment, comments ideally will address, issues with accuracy or substance. And we'll be looking for very specific comments that, point to sections of the report where you've identified that something is inaccurate or something's missing, or you could also be submitting comments on, improvements you'd like to see in the process or how you'd like to be involved. Next slide. So the last phase that I'll be talking about is refine. So at this phase, BOEM is going to transmit any substantive comments that we've received from the public, as well as our own comments on the semi-annual report to the lessee. And then the lessee is required to adequately address those comments by either revising the report and correcting errors or inconsistencies in that report, and then it would get reposted online with those corrections. Or depending on the timing or substance of the comment, they'd be addressed in the subsequent report 6 months later. And also important to this refining process is the project itself is going to change and evolve based off the feedback that the lessees and developers receive. So there's a bullet here highlighting this requirement to minimize, mitigate, and redress effects. So the lease stipulation spells out that if adverse effects cannot be avoided, that the lessee must make reasonable efforts to implement the project in a manner that minimizes, mitigates, and/or redresses the project's adverse effects, if any, on tribes and parties. And parties there includes ocean users, underserved communities, and other stakeholders. And then the last bullet there is, again, the whole engagement process itself is likely going to evolve based off of your feedback on how you want to be engaged, what's working, what's not working. And this is, just kind of highlighting that refinement is going to occur with the engagement itself. All right, next slide. This is just the same process and graphic that I just shared, depicted in a different way, depending on how you like to process information and envision the process. So here it's a bit more linear and chronological. But essentially you have the blue ribbon of engagement happening throughout the process, a report being issued every 6 months, that kind of 2-month feedback period that I had talked about. Feedback is welcome at any time, but in that kind of 2-month period, you'd be looking for clarifications on inaccuracies or gaps in the report that's been posted online. And then that refining process is going to be occurring, and then it begins again with 6 months later with the next report. So next slide. So for accountability and enforcement, you remember that's one of kind of the key themes here. So how do we enforce that the lessee listens to the comments? Well, should the lessee not address the comments provided by the lessor, BOEM, in a timely and adequate manner, BOEM reserves the right to require specific mitigation, including but not limited to requiring third-party verification or mediation at the lessee's expense, increased reporting frequency, or designation that the lease is not in good standing. That's language right from the lease stipulation. Next slide, Luke. So how do these kind of key documents and project milestones for a wind project, so the site assessment plan, the construction operation plan, and EIS, how do they fit into this engagement framework? Well, essentially the early and frequent engagement that's required through this reporting requirement will inform the development and content of these documents along the way. So you'll be providing input on survey design, array design, transmission, siting, et cetera. And if substantive comments that you provide are not addressed, and the developers do not make reasonable efforts to avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse effects, BOEM may designate that the lease is not in good standing. So just wanted to highlight that. Next slide. And we are still looking for feedback on this process. So while the stipulation, has been written and is in these leases, that's essentially a blueprint with required guidelines for how the process is going to work, but we'd still like your feedback on the implementation of the process. So the lessees are required to engage and consult with you, but you have a voice in what that engagement looks like. So potentially in person or virtual meetings are preferred, regional, doc-based. We want to hear, what kind of engagement you prefer. Perhaps you'd like to emphasize coordinated engagement to lessen the total number of meetings. Do you have questions or feedback on how that would work? Are there meeting best practices you'd like to see followed to ensure that the engagement is meaningful? And then lastly, do you have any thoughts on the review and comment process of the completed semi-annual reports that'll be posted on the website? And then lastly, we still want to learn from you, what you think of this process. So while the stipulation itself can't be changed now, we would still like to know if you think something's missing from this process. All right, next slide. So moving from engagement to one of the other new lease stipulations, project labor agreements. The lessee must make every reasonable effort to enter a project labor agreement covering the construction stage of any project proposed for the lease area. And next slide. And then for supply chain, there's a requirement to establish a statement of goals that describe plans for contributing to the creation of a robust and resilient US-based offshore wind supply chain, as well as an operating fee credit to incentivize the procurement of offshore wind components in the United States. Next slide. So next steps, again, I just was talking about the feedback we're looking for. The timing of that feedback is really open-ended, but I will say that, feedback that we get in the next, say, couple of months by the end of March are most likely to be incorporated into the initial guidance that we are hoping to generate that would kind of feed into that first semi-annual progress report for these leases that would likely be due in approximately, November of this year. But again, any guidance we produce will be an evolving document, and we're happy to take the feedback at any time. The sale date for the New York Bight is February 23rd, and then the leases would be executed in May of this year. I think that is all that I have.